Hello, I'm Dr. Thompson, and I'm here to tell you about Chapter 4 from Biology, Carbon and the Molecular Diversity of Life. Carbon is the key atom for all life on Earth, as we're going to be going through over the next two lectures, counting this one. I wanted to introduce carbon a little bit and illustrate some things about how carbon works in organic form. So this isn't really discussed in the book, but I think that these are important concepts. So carbon appears naturally in two main forms on Earth, in its physical form anyway, as graphite or as diamond. And this is elemental carbon, so this is considered inorganic carbon. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the basic atomic structure of carbon. So carbon takes the sixth position on the periodic table because it has 6 protons. There's also 6 neutrons, which means that it has a molecular weight of 12. And then, of course, there are 6 electrons. So the inner electron shell can only hold 2 electrons. Therefore, that's where the first 2 electrons are located. And then the outer one can hold up to 8 electrons. But because carbon has 6 protons in its most elemental form, it's going to have just 4 electrons. And this is going to be really important for how many partners the carbon can bind to. Because this outer electron shell has 4 available places for electrons, it can mean that it can have basically 4 covalent bonds, is typically how it can work. And what this means is that because it has 4 covalent bonds, it typically forms a tetrahedral shape. And so this is a very simple hydrocarbon known as methane. You may have heard of it. It's pretty famous for being a greenhouse gas. It also plays an important role in basic biochemistry as well. So this is the basic formula for methane. There's 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens. And this is an illustration of the overall molecular shape of methane. So there's 1 carbon atom in the middle, and then there are 4 hydrogens attached to it in the 4 positions that would be around carbon. Now, given that there are 4 basic bonds that it can make, the most stable conformation that it can make with these 4 bonds is going to be so that it makes a tetrahedral shape. So carbon's going to be here in the middle. There's also this hydrogen that's bound here. So this is a covalent bond between this carbon and this hydrogen. And there's another covalent bond between this carbon and this hydrogen. And all of these are in the same plane. So this one's directly above this carbon, and this is down to the lower right of this carbon. Now, this is also a covalent bond. It isn't different from this, other than the fact that it's actually supposed to be pointed towards the viewer, so coming out of the screen. And this is also another covalent bond to this hydrogen, but it is going away from the viewer, from the carbon, so it's pointed into the screen. So this is one way that we can illustrate the different kinds of covalent bonds that different molecules can have within them. So again, this is that same sort of illustration of carbon, except now we've got it rotated to the other side. So this is a different way of looking at that same molecule. And this is another way of illustrating carbon. This is called a ball and stick model, with carbon in the middle and hydrogens to the top and to the sides. And this is kind of nice because then you can really kind of see that tetrahedral shape. Now, if carbon makes a whole bunch of bonds to other carbons, where each of them are in a tetrahedral form. So each carbon atom is bound to 4 other carbon atoms, and all of them are bound to each other. There's a way that this can get all combined where it makes this nice tight lattice that is actually really, really strong. And this is the underlying molecular conformation of diamond. So if this just gets repeated over and over and over again with billions and billions of atoms, you'll have yourself a diamond. That's how you get a diamond. And of course, we know diamonds are the hardest natural substance on Earth. And the reason why is because of this very tight, very stable molecular strength, the molecular structure of the conformation of carbon when it is in this tetrahedral shape. Now, carbon is arguably the key to life's diversity for many reasons. And the study of carbon-based molecules is known as organic chemistry. So those are things that contain carbon regardless of its origin. And typically we include carbon and other molecules. Carbon just by itself is largely inorganic, like diamonds and graphite, but there are other kinds that are. So the major elements of life on Earth, so the major atoms that make up life on Earth are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And these are going to be the main things, and they are present in nearly uniform percentages across all organisms. Carbon's ability to form 4 bonds makes it the foundation for an immense variety of organic molecules. And the versatility of carbon underlies the extraordinary diversity of life on Earth. So this will be some of the basic things that we're going to be talking about for this whole presentation as well as the next presentation. Now, we talked a little bit about diamond. Now we're going to be talking about hydrocarbons. Did mention methane, so that's a hydrocarbon as well. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation is going to be largely hydrocarbons. So this is an example of a hydrocarbon known as hexane. It's called hexane because there are 6 carbons. And this is one way of illustrating hexane. So each point is supposed to have a carbon at it, is the way that looks. So there's a carbon here, 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 and here. When we illustrate organic molecules like this, we don't draw the bonds of the hydrogens. They're just assumed to be there because it's a pain in the neck to draw all of those hydrogens. So this is a perfectly fine way of drawing hexane. One that is a little bit more informative, but a lot more work is drawing it like this, where you illustrate each carbon, right? We got the 6 of them, and then we've got all the hydrogens attached. So one thing I want to note is that this carbon is attached to 2 other carbons, right? Carbon to 2 other carbons, which means that it only has room for 2 other bonds, and that is filled with 2 hydrogens. This carbon being on the end is bound to 3 other hydrogens. So we have a CH3 at the end, and then there are CH2s in the middle, and then another CH3 at the end. Okay, so it's important to keep track of those things. And then again, of course, we've got our ball and stick form, and I took this off of an excellent website, a resource that's provided from the National Institutes of Health called PubChem. So if you are ever curious about or confused by like what a particular molecule might look like, you can type it into PubChem. There's a very good chance that it will be in there. They have a huge, huge resource. So we're going to take a look at that and see what that looks like. Okay, so if you go into PubChem and if you type in some molecules such as hexane, you're going to come up with a series of choices. Usually the top choice is going to be the first thing that you can click on, and that will be your chemical. And this is hexane, and you can see just how long this website is. I mean, there's tons of information in here. So if you want to learn anything about a chemical, like this is a good resource to start with. But we're interested in just looking at the overall molecular conformation of what these things look like. So if you click on this, this is the 3D shape. And if we want to look at ball and stick, or if we want to look just at sticks or wireframe or space filling, these are all different options. But the cool thing is that this is selectable and movable. So we can move them around. You can click animate to move it. We can change it to ball and stick again. And we can also do it like this. And you can also just grab it, move it around, and while it's animating and moving. So super great way to see the shapes of molecules, because this will illustrate it for you. My preference is ball and stick. Shape is kind of nice because that also is a little bit closer to kind of how it works in physics. It doesn't actually work like this, but this works better in my brain to see how the things are actually connected. So here are 3 simple organic molecules illustrating the different shapes. And this is taken right out of the textbook. So we've got methane. We've already talked about methane. Here are different ways that we can look at it with its basic molecular formula, its structural formula. This is the ball and stick model. You can see the tetrahedron there. And this is the space filling model. That is also tetrahedral in shape. And here is ethane. So this is just another carbon attached to the methane. And you can see that it's basically CH3 on either side, but it's C2H6 because we've got one carbon attached to another carbon. And this is the basic ball and stick model of what that looks like. And here's the space filling model. So another type of bond that carbon can make is that it can also make double bonds, which is also going to be very important to understand. and this is ethene. So ethene is instead C2H4, and that's because there is a double bond between the two carbons. So we'll explain a little bit more of that double bonding in a moment. But first, I want to talk about, and obviously that changes the overall conformation of what this can look like. But first, we need to talk about how atoms can bind to each other. So atoms, the kinds of bonds that we're going to be talking about today are covalent bonds, and that's going to be very much dependent upon the valence of what an individual atom has. And this is a nice table because it illustrates nicely like how valences work for some of the major elements that make up organic molecules. So we've got hydrogen here, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. Now let's start with hydrogen. Hydrogen's a little bit special because it only has one proton, therefore it also only has one electron, but it does have that inner electron shell. And since it only has one electron, it means that there's an opening place within its valence shell, which means that it can bind to other things and share its electron with another another atom that has an available space in its valence shell in order to make a covalent bond. So it's looking for one more electron in order to fill its valence shell. Therefore, it can only make one bond with another atom. Oxygen has two electrons in its outer valence shell, right? So there's two available spots. That's what these little things are meant to indicate, that these are open. And then the yellow dots are the electrons that are in there. So that means that oxygen can, since it has only two available spaces, it can only make two bonds with whatever it's binding to. Nitrogen has three available spots, which means it can make three bonds with whatever it's binding to. And as we already mentioned, carbon has four open spaces in its valence shell. And so therefore it's looking for four other electrons in order to have stability. And therefore it can make bonds with four other elements. So this is showing propane. We looked at methane, we looked at ethane. This is just the next one in that kind of carbon chain, which is adding an additional carbon, and therefore it's propane. But this is a very complex way of showing propane, because what we're illustrating here are how each of the hydrogens are also bound to the carbons and how they're sharing their valence electrons with each other, right? So as we mentioned, each hydrogen would have had an empty valence electron, but if it's bound to a carbon, it is now sharing its empty space with the carbon, and therefore the carbon can put its electron in that valence space. And then because the carbon has an available electron valence space, it can take on the hydrogen. So that's how you create a single covalent bond, with these two electrons being shared with each other. And because carbon has four available open electrons, it can make four bonds. And at the end of a propane molecule, you're going to have three hydrogens and the carbon making a single bond with a carbon as well, the one that's in the center. And that carbon is bound to two carbons. So therefore, its bonds are filled with, it has two bonds with the other two, and it has two available open electron valence spaces in its open valence shell. And therefore, it can only bind to two other partners. And that's, if we're talking about just hydrogen, therefore, it's only going to be binding to hydrogen. And then the carbon at the end is going to have three hydrogens filling the three available spaces, since this available space in its valence shell is filled with the bond with the other carbon. So that's essentially how carbon electron sharing happens to create these covalent bonds. It's an important concept, and it's critical for understanding how molecules are formed from atoms. Now, one thing about carbon is that it can also make ring structures. So these are some of the most simple kinds of carbon-based ring structures that you can find. So we're only looking again at hydrocarbons here. So cyclopropane is three carbons, right? Because there's three of them. It's called cyclo because it's making a circle with itself. And this, from what I understand, is actually a very unstable structure. It's largely hypothetical. I mean, it can be created in a lab, but because it's so unstable, it tends to break down very quickly. It's just something about the torsional forces involved that it doesn't really hold together very well, but it is something that can be formed. So cyclobutane is definitely something that does exist. Same with cyclopentane and cyclohexane. So these are things that you can actually find in nature, but they're also primarily used in industrial processes. Some of these are the result of the kinds of hydrocarbons that we use in fossil fuels. So, and like things like natural gas and that kind of thing. So, but this is what it would basically look like. This has to form some sort of square shape because, it only has 4 carbons. Cyclopentane has to form some sort of pentagonal shape because it's only got 5 carbons. And then hexane is going to form a hexagonal shape. And this is actually really, really important because this is a kind of molecule that we find in all kinds of organic shapes and other molecules. So let's talk a little bit about cyclohexane. So cyclohexane is C6H12. This is the basic formula for cyclohexane. Again, this is the basic drawing for it. You can see that it's really quite simple. You just, you have each of these points has a single carbon that's attached to it. And because each carbon is attached to 2 other carbons, it means that there are only 2 other hydrogens. And if you're interested in seeing the shape here, you can take a look up for yourself. You can take a look at the molecule on PubChem, but we're going to take a look right now as well. Okay, so I've gone to PubChem. I looked up cyclohexane. Here's the structures here. So here's cyclohexane. If we want to look at the 2D, this is just that. But here's the 3D, the conformer. Again, you can look at space filling, wireframe, balls and sticks. I'm going to look at balls and sticks. We're going to go to full screen. And this is kind of interesting because what I want you to appreciate is that cyclohexane is not exactly flat, right? There's no way to get this molecule perfectly flat. In fact, you can see that there's kind of a chair conformation with cyclohexane. And this is going to be important because when we get to talking about isomers in the next lecture, the fact that carbon makes these tetrahedral shapes is going to lead to relatively complex molecular structures, which is not going to be necessarily flat. There's no way that this can be flat if each carbon is making just a single bond with each other carbon. Now, there is a way to get a 6-sided shape of a carbon ring to be flat, and we'll talk about that next. So as I mentioned, carbon can make double bonds with other atoms, including carbon. The example I'm showing here is ethylene, also known as ethene. This is the basic drawing of what ethylene looks like. It's just 2 lines to each other. And so from this, you would know that these carbons have a double bond between them. There's 1 carbon here, there's another carbon here, and there would be 2 hydrogens coming off of it. And that's what the ball and stick looks like. And of course, this is the way that we can draw this, showing its overall basic molecular structure. Now, the way to make a ring out of, to get so that it's flat is actually going to be dependent upon these double bonds. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. So benzene is a key aromatic ring in biochemistry. So aromatic hydrocarbons are those in which form rings. And so cyclohexane is C6H12, but benzene is C6H6. There's only 6 hydrogens attached. And that is because we have this interesting conformation where some carbons have single bonds with themselves, but some carbons also have double bonds with themselves. And the thing about this structure is that, you might be able to designate each carbon as its own individual point, but in actuality, these electrons are sort of shared in an electron cloud. This is known as electron delocalization. So these electrons that are between these 2 carbons are actually sort of shared here. This is a weird quantal thing that kind of happens. This is the way to draw out benzene. But this is another way of drawing benzene because this resonance circle is meant to symbolize that electron delocalization phenomenon that occurs. So let's take a look at benzene at PubChem. Okay, so this is benzene, page for benzene. And if we go down to the 3D structure and we go to the ball and stick model, what you can see here is that this is flat, which is really cool That means that there's a way that this can be flat as long as there are these like three double bonds between pairs of carbons. And that is one way in which you can get a flat structure. So there's no way that you could have this where like all the carbons have double bonds, because then they wouldn't be attached to other carbons. This is the only way that this can work so that it's actually flat. Um, so the thing that's interesting about this is that this form is what underlies how graphite is formed. So graphite is simply a bunch of carbons that are bound together in a lattice of this hexagonal pattern, this honeycomb pattern, with no hydrogens involved at all. And so what you're going to have are sheets of carbons that are attached to each other in big, big, long sheets. And in fact, this is what this looks like. The graphene carbon bonds, they do not form a tetrahedral shape. Instead, they form this triangular shape. And if they're bound like this is what the basic formula of graphite looks like. This is known as graphene. And graphene are these sheets that are between, that lay on top of each other. And then there are other forces, these van der Waals forces, that sort of hold the sheets to each other. But these bonds are much stronger than these bonds, which is why graphite is actually used as a lubricant. So you can actually, so unlike diamond, which is super sharp, graphite can actually act as a lubricant because these sheets can actually slip between each other. But there's also interesting work happening with graphene, in that graphene might have some really interesting carbon-based properties to actually make these like really strong, long sheets. Usually graphite does not have large sheets of graphene. It tends to break down into somewhat smaller sheets, but there's a lot of industrial processing involved with this. Now, there are four ways that carbon skeletons that can be added to each other, and where carbon can be form different conformations. So all of these are hydrocarbons. And as we've seen, there are ways that we can vary them and to get different conformations. So obviously carbon skeletons can vary in length. We talked about ethane and propane. Some other things, of course, is that you can have branching patterns. So all of these have the same basic number of carbons and hydrogens, these two molecules, but one is butane. So there's 4 carbons in a single chain like this, but you can also have methylpropane, so you've got a methyl group attached to a propane group. And so at the second position of the propane, there is a methyl group attached. This is also known as isobutane. As you know, that for any of you that are familiar with natural gases, this is part of a natural gas. So some of them may be branched or unbranched. That's another way to get variation of carbon skeletons. And then you have the presence of rings, such as cyclohexane and benzene. And so these are obviously important concepts. So as I mentioned, there are the valences of the major organic molecules that make up organic chemistry. We talked about hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. And that so not all carbon molecules are simply just bound to hydrogen. And in fact, they do more interesting things if they bind to things other than hydrogen, such as oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, those kinds of things. And so we're going to be talking about an example such as carbon dioxide, which is also very important greenhouse gas. And this is an illustration of exactly how carbon atoms can partner with other atoms, such as oxygen. And in this case, basically what you're seeing here is that carbon dioxide is that there's a double bond between the one oxygen on one side and the carbon in the middle, and then oxygen on the other side, again with the carbon in the middle. So because carbon has 4 open valences and oxygen has 2 open valences, one oxygen can share 2 of the electrons with the carbon. And then carbon will share 2 of its electrons with the oxygen to sort of complete the bond there. But then carbon would still have 2 available electrons, and therefore that can be shared with another oxygen, and this is how you get carbon dioxide. And so, yeah, like this is this is actually quite a common kind of conformation. Carbon making these double bonds with oxygens, And in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about functional groups. And this we'll be revisiting this, and this important conformation will be discussed in the next lecture. Nitrogen, so this is just to kind of complete the table. Since nitrogen has 3 open valence electron spaces in its valence shell, it typically forms 3 bonds. One example of this is urea, the major component that makes up urine. And as you can see, so this is what the molecular shape of urea is. There's that double bond with an oxygen there that we just talked about, but which is one component of urea. But urea is a nitrogenous waste, and it's one way of getting rid of ammonia type products. And so carbon will make one bond with a nitrogen, which is bound to 2 hydrogens to create this sort of triangular shape. And so, because nitrogen can only bind to 3 partners, it tends to make a triangular shape, not a tetrahedral shape, because it can only bind to 3 partners at most. And so that's what we'll see in here in this example. So these are the nitrogenous bases that make up DNA. So it's just another example that I'm including here. So we've got, this is the C, T, A, and G that makes up DNA. And then, I say this is DNA, but uracil is found most often in RNA, but it's also a nitrogenous base. And as you can see that because these are the nitrogenous bases, you have nitrogens that create, so they can make double bonds with carbons, such as here in guanine. So there's a double bond to one carbon and then a single bond to the other carbon, but there's no hydrogens attached. But here's a nitrogen over on this side of the guanine where there's one hydrogen attached, and then the other bonds are shared with 2 different carbons. And then sometimes there are the nitrogen groups that are on the outside, and you can see that there's a single carbon that's attached to nitrogen. So this is one covalent bond, and this nitrogen would have 2 hydrogens attached to it. So that's basically just a couple of examples of some of the, probably some of the more important nitrogenous compounds that are found in organic chemistry. But there's lots more than this, that's for sure. So this is the end of this first lecture. I wanted to highlight some key points. First is that carbon is a key atom underlying the diversity of life. Second is that carbon atoms can be combined with carbon, hydrogen, and other atoms to make organic molecules. Third is that carbon tends to make tetrahedral conformations with its partners. Another key point for this lecture is that valences are key to understanding why atoms bond in the way they do. And that carbon can form double bonds as well, which changes the shape of the molecule, such as the way cyclohexane is very different from benzene. So I hope you enjoyed this. Hope that this has been informative. Look forward to talking about this lecture in class. Thank you very much.